Welcome back to CrimeWave Radio. Before you settle in for the night, let us know where you're listening from in the comments and what time you're watching this. If you're enjoying these chilling crimes, be sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's relax, turn down the lights, and dive into tonight's disturbing cases. Story 1. The Carolina Reaper. On the 18th of May, deep in the rural countryside of South Carolina, a boy was growing up in a world that would shape him into one of the most feared criminals in American history. Donald Henry Pee Wee Gaskins would later claim responsibility for a staggering number of murders, making him one of the most notorious serial killers the country had ever seen. But before he became infamous, before his name was whispered in fear, Donald Gaskins was just a child. A boy shaped by hardship, rejection, and an early tendency toward crime. His story begins not with violence, but with a troubled upbringing that would steer him down a dark path. Donald Gaskins was born on March 13, 1933 in Florence County, South Carolina. His mother, struggling to raise him on her own, had little time or patience for him. He was small for his age, earning the nickname Pee Wee, which he resented. His childhood was unstable, marked by frequent moves and an ever-changing stream of people in his home. From a young age, Gaskins exhibited defiant behavior, often getting into fights and skipping school. With little supervision, he spent much of his time roaming the streets, looking for trouble. He fell in with a group of local delinquents, and together, they began committing minor crimes, such as breaking into houses and stealing from neighborhood stores. It wasn't long before these petty crimes escalated. Gaskins had a temper, and when he felt slighted, he often lashed out with aggression. Authority figures saw him as uncontrollable, and by the time he was in his early teens, he had already had several run-ins with law enforcement. At age 15, Gaskins was caught during a burglary and was sentenced to the South Carolina Industrial School for Boys, a juvenile detention center. It was here that he first experienced the harsh realities of incarceration. Instead of being rehabilitated, he learned to adapt to a world where strength and manipulation were key to survival. Desperate to escape, Gaskins made multiple attempts to break free from the facility. He eventually succeeded, fleeing the state, trying to start a new life, but trouble seemed to follow him wherever he went. In the years that followed, he drifted across the South, engaging in various criminal activities, including theft and fraud. By his early 20s, Gaskins had developed a reputation as a hot-tempered and unpredictable figure. He often got into violent altercations, which led to his first serious prison sentence for assault with a deadly weapon. Life behind bars only intensified Gaskins' criminal mindset. He learned how to navigate prison politics, gaining the ability to manipulate others to his advantage. When he was released, he returned to society with a hardened outlook. Determined not to go back to prison for minor crimes, he shifted his focus to more serious offenses. It was during this period that Gaskins' destructive tendencies took a darker turn, leading him toward a series of violent crimes that would eventually shock the nation. In the early 1960s, Gaskins was released from prison after serving time for burglary. He returned to South Carolina, where he tried to live a seemingly normal life. He married, started a family, and found work in local communities. But beneath the surface, he was already planning his next move. According to his later confessions, his first known murders occurred in 1969. He claimed to have developed what he called a coastal kill strategy, a twisted plan in which he would travel along highways in South Carolina, targeting hitchhikers, drifters, and vulnerable women. His first known victims were young women he picked up along the roadsides, offering them rides before turning on them. These attacks were random and brutal, carried out with little connection between the victims. Unlike other serial killers who followed specific patterns, Gaskins often changed his approach, making him harder to track. He later referred to these crimes as his recreational killings, claiming he had an uncontrollable urge to kill, one that only grew stronger with each act. While Gaskins carried out random murders along the highways, he also engaged in what he called serious murders, killings that were more personal. These were individuals he knew, people who he felt had wronged him or posed a threat. One such victim was Doreen Dempsey, a young mother who trusted Gaskins enough to get into his car. What followed was a gruesome crime that cemented his reputation as a remorseless killer. By the early 1970s, Gaskins had built a network of criminal associates who, unknowingly, helped him dispose of evidence or cover his tracks. He gained a reputation as someone not to be crossed, intimidating those around him into silence. Despite his growing number of victims, Gaskins remained under the radar for years. He was a skilled manipulator who charmed his neighbors, friends, and even law enforcement officers. His small stature and unassuming personality made it difficult for people to believe he was capable of such horrors. He also buried many of his victims in remote areas, making it nearly impossible for authorities to connect the disappearances to a single perpetrator. For years, families searched for their missing loved ones, never knowing they had fallen prey to Gaskins. Gaskins had always been cautious, disposing of victims in remote areas and avoiding direct links to his crimes. But in 1975, he made a critical mistake. One of his criminal associates, Walter Neely, had been a small-time crook who ran errands for Gaskins and helped him with minor illegal activities. At first, Neely believed Gaskins' stories of murder were mere exaggerations, until Gaskins brought him to a secluded burial site and showed him the remains of multiple victims. Over time, Neely became terrified of Gaskins, realizing the full extent of his crimes. But it wasn't until law enforcement began questioning local criminals about missing persons that Neely finally cracked. In late 1975, he came forward and told investigators everything he knew. Neely's confession led authorities to Gaskins' personal graveyard, where they uncovered the remains of at least 8 victims. Some were identified as young women who had gone missing while hitchhiking, while others were known associates of Gaskins who had mysteriously disappeared. Gaskins was promptly arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Once in custody, Gaskins did not remain silent. Instead, he shocked authorities by claiming that he had killed over 100 people, a number that, to this day, remains disputed. He described his method of selecting victims and admitted to both his random murders and his serious murders, which targeted people he personally knew. Investigators struggled to verify all his claims. Some of his confessions contained gruesome details that matched crime scenes, while others seemed exaggerated or fabricated. Whether or not he truly reached the triple-digit body count he boasted about remains unknown. However, what was undeniable was that he was one of the most prolific killers in South Carolina's history. Gaskins' trial began in 1976, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness testimony, physical evidence, and Neely's cooperation all painted a horrifying picture of a man who had spent decades killing without remorse. He was convicted of 8 murders and sentenced to death. However, after South Carolina temporarily banned the death penalty, his sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole. For most criminals, this would be the end of the story. But for Donald Gaskins, there was one final act of violence that would shock everyone. After being convicted of multiple murders, Donald Gaskins was sentenced to life in prison without parole, locked behind the walls of a maximum security prison in South Carolina. Many believe the state's most feared killer was finally where he belonged. But Gaskins' story was not yet over. Even in captivity, he found a way to carry out one last, shocking act of violence, an act that would send him to death row. In 1982, while serving his life sentence, Gaskins was approached by a fellow inmate, Tony Simo. Simo's stepfather, Rudolph Tyner, was on death row for murdering 2 convenience store owners during a robbery. Desperate for revenge, Simo sought out Gaskins, who had become somewhat of a feared figure in the prison community. Gaskins agreed to help, and over the following weeks he befriended Tyner, sharing meals and gaining his trust. What Tyner didn't know was that Gaskins had smuggled in plastic explosives, which he crafted into a device disguised as a radio. On September 2, 1982, Gaskins convinced Tyner to place the radio up to his ear, claiming it would allow them to communicate with each other from different cells. When Tyner followed Gaskins' instructions, Gaskins detonated the device, killing Tyner instantly. It was an unthinkable crime, murder committed from within a prison cell against a man already condemned to die. The killing of Rudolph Tyner was Gaskins' undoing, While he initially showed no remorse, even boasting to other inmates about the murder, the evidence against him was overwhelming. Prison authorities found recordings of Gaskins describing the plot, and he was swiftly charged with murder once again. This time there was no delay or loophole to save him. Gaskins was sentenced to death by electric chair. His own actions had sealed his fate, ensuring he would never again harm another person. At 1:10 a.m., Donald Pee Wee Gaskins was pronounced dead. Story 2. Skylar's Law. On the night of July 5th, 2012, 16-year-old Skylar Nisa quietly slipped out of her bedroom window in Star City, West Virginia, and climbed into a waiting car. She had done this before, sneaking out for late-night drives with her best friends, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. It seemed like just another summer night of teenage adventure. But Skylar would never return home. By morning, she was missing, and the truth about what happened that night would shock her family and community to their core. Skylar Nisa was a bright, ambitious student who excelled in school. She had been inseparable from Sheila Eddy since they were young children, and when Rachel Schoaf entered their lives, they became an unbreakable trio. At least, that's what it seemed like on the surface. But behind the smiles and social media posts, things weren't as perfect as they appeared. Tensions had been growing between Skylar and her two best friends. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Skylar had started to feel like an outsider in the friendship. There were cryptic tweets from her account, hinting at betrayal and secrets being kept from her. One tweet read, "You doing stuff like this is why I will never completely trust you." Another, just weeks before she vanished, ominously stated, "Just know I know." Still, no one could have imagined just how deep the resentment ran, or that it would turn deadly. When Skylar failed to show up for work at Walmart the next day, her parents, Dave and Mary Nisa, were immediately alarmed. Skylar was responsible, reliable, and had never disappeared without explanation before. They checked her bedroom and noticed that her window was open, with a small bench placed underneath, suggesting she had snuck out. But her phone charger, makeup, and daily essentials were still in her room, indicating she hadn't planned to be gone for long. Security footage from the apartment complex cameras provided the first real clue. At 12:31 a.m., a grainy image showed Skylar getting into an unknown vehicle. But with no sign of a struggle, it was clear she had left voluntarily. Her parents reported her missing, but initially, the police did not take the case seriously. Because Skylar had willingly left home and had run away before, albeit briefly, authorities believed she would return. No Amber Alert was issued, but as hours stretched into days, and Skylar never contacted anyone, it became clear this was not a runaway case. Something was terribly wrong. Skylar's best friends, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf, were among the last people to see her. When questioned, Sheila told investigators that they had picked Skylar up around midnight, but that she had asked them to drop her off a few minutes later at the end of her street. Rachel backed up Sheila's story, and for a while the police had no reason to doubt them. But then something suspicious happened. As Skylar's disappearance gained media attention, Sheila Eddy began acting strangely. She frequently posted about how much she missed Skylar, tweeting things like, "Skylar, come back, I miss you so much." She even helped the Nisa family distribute missing person flyers and spent time with Skylar's grieving parents, all while knowing the dark truth. Her behavior was unsettling, but without evidence, police had no solid leads. It seemed like Skylar had vanished without a trace. Months passed with no sign of Skylar, and the investigation began to stall. Then, in December 2012, Rachel Schoaf cracked under the pressure. She had become increasingly unstable, suffering panic attacks and emotional breakdowns. Eventually, she confessed to her family and later to police, revealing a horrifying truth. Skylar wasn't missing. She was murdered, and Sheila Eddy was her killer. Rachel's confession led authorities to a shallow grave in rural Pennsylvania, where they uncovered Skylar's remains, buried under branches and snow. The truth about why they had done it was as senseless as the crime itself. By December 2012, Rachel Schoaf could no longer keep her secret. Her mental state had been deteriorating, She suffered from panic attacks, guilt-driven breakdowns, and emotional instability. Her parents, alarmed by her erratic behavior, pushed her to reveal what was troubling her. Finally, she broke. Rachel confessed to her mother, then to law enforcement, that she and Sheila Eddy had killed Skylar Neese. Her words sent shockwaves through the small community. Skylar Neese hadn't been kidnapped by a stranger or run away. She had been murdered by the very people she trusted most. But one question remained. Why? When asked why she and Sheila had murdered Skylar, Rachel gave a chillingly simple response. We just didn't like her anymore. Investigators were stunned. There was no feud, no explosive fight, no dark secret. It was a premeditated act of cold-blooded cruelty, the result of nothing more than teenage pettiness and peer pressure. Skylar had been growing apart from her friends for months. Tensions had been rising, and Sheila and Rachel had started excluding her from plans. Rather than distancing themselves naturally, they decided to do something unthinkable. They plotted Skylar's murder for months, deciding that they would lure her out, drive to a secluded area, and kill her together. It was a decision made with disturbing casualness, as if they were planning a night out rather than a brutal crime. On July 5, 2012, Sheila and Rachel put their plan into action. They called Skylar, convincing her to sneak out for a late-night drive, promising it would be just like old times. Skylar, still clinging to the hope that things could go back to the way they were, agreed. She climbed out of her bedroom window at 12:31 a.m., slipping into the back seat of Sheila's car. The trio drove across the state line into rural Pennsylvania, to a desolate, wooded area that they had scouted beforehand as the perfect place to commit their crime. Once there, they stepped out of the car and began chatting, acting as though it was just another harmless night of sneaking out. But then, on a signal they had planned, Sheila and Rachel grabbed the knives they had hidden in their jackets and attacked. Skylar fought desperately, trying to run, trying to scream for help, but she was outnumbered. Rachel later revealed Skylar's final words. Why? Even as her best friends were stabbing her, Skylar couldn't comprehend the betrayal. She fought with everything she had, but after more than 50 stab wounds, she succumbed to her injuries. Sheila and Rachel then dragged her body into the woods, trying to dig a grave. But the ground was too rocky. Instead, they covered her corpse with branches and debris, leaving her abandoned in the dirt, then drove home as if nothing had happened. After the murder, Sheila Eddy played the part of the grieving best friend. She cried with Skylar's parents, posted messages on social media begging for her to return, and even helped distribute missing person flyers. She pretended to be heartbroken, all while knowing exactly what had happened. Rachel, on the other hand, began to unravel. Her guilt grew heavier, and soon she couldn't keep up the act. When she finally cracked, it wasn't out of remorse. It was because the weight of the crime had broken her mentally. Once Rachel confessed, she agreed to lead investigators to Skylar's remains. On January 16, 2013, authorities found Skylar Neese's badly decomposed body in the Pennsylvania woods. It had taken more than 6 months, but her parents finally had answers, though the truth was almost too horrible to comprehend. With Rachel Schoaf's confession on December 28, 2012, the investigation took a dramatic turn. Skylar Neese's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a cold-blooded murder planned by 2 teenage girls. Rachel's confession was enough to solidify Sheila Eddy as the prime suspect, but authorities needed more evidence before making an arrest. They couldn't risk Sheila slipping away. In the meantime, Rachel agreed to wear a wire to gather incriminating statements from Sheila. Investigators also monitored Sheila's social media and began looking for any signs of her involvement. While Rachel was breaking under the weight of her guilt, Sheila Eddy showed no remorse. She continued living her life as if nothing had happened. She tweeted, went to parties, and kept up the act of a grieving friend. Even when Rachel was sent to a psychiatric facility in early 2013, Sheila visited her, as if nothing was wrong. But as the pressure mounted, Sheila started to grow reckless. Her tweets took a dark turn, with cryptic messages that investigators later believed were hints at her involvement. One tweet read, We really did go on 3. This matched Rachel's confession, in which she revealed that she and Sheila had planned to attack Skylar on the count of 3. Another tweet simply said, "No one on this earth can handle me and Rachel. If you think you can, you're wrong." These messages, combined with Rachel's cooperation, gave police the final push they needed. On May 1, 2013, Rachel Schoaf officially pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, admitting in court that she and Sheila had conspired to kill Skylar. Now, all eyes were on Sheila. Even after Rachel's guilty plea, Sheila Eddy still believed she could get away with murder. She continued to act normal, even tweeting "Rest easy, Skylar," a move that infuriated both investigators and the Neese family. But on May 31, 2013, Sheila's world came crashing down. A sealed indictment was issued for her arrest, charging her with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. On June 7, 2013, Sheila was lured out of her home under the guise of going shopping with her mother. Instead, she was met by police, handcuffed, and taken into custody. The arrest was caught on surveillance footage, showing Sheila's stunned expression the moment she realized her time was up. Unlike Rachel, Sheila refused to confess. She pleaded not guilty, forcing the case to move toward trial. Rachel Schoaf was the star witness against Sheila. During her court appearance, she recounted the murder in horrifying detail, confirming what investigators already knew. She told the court how they had plotted for months, how they had stabbed Skylar repeatedly, and how they had left her body in the woods to rot. Skylar's parents, Dave and Mary Neese, listened in horror, forced to relive the unimaginable pain of their daughter's final moments. As the case against her strengthened, Sheila realized she had no way out. On January 24, 2014, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Rachel, who had cooperated early, was sentenced to 30 years in prison, eligible for parole after 10 years. Though the legal system had held Sheila and Rachel accountable, nothing could undo the pain and loss Skylar's parents endured. Her tragic murder led to changes in West Virginia law. West Virginia passed Skylar's Law, which required immediate Amber Alerts for all missing children, even if authorities initially suspected a runaway situation. Story 3. The Attack. On the night of November 2nd, 2014, 22-year-old Carlesha Freeland-Gaither was walking home in Germantown, Philadelphia, after visiting her godson's house. The streets were quiet, and she was only a few blocks from her apartment. As she walked along West Coulter Street, a dark-colored vehicle pulled up beside her. Before she could react, a man jumped out of the car and lunged at her. Carlesha fought back. She screamed, kicked, and clawed, refusing to go down without a fight. Surveillance footage captured the violent struggle, showing her being dragged toward the car as she desperately tried to break free. At one point, she even smashed out the rear passenger side window in a desperate attempt to escape, but it wasn't enough. The attacker forced her into the vehicle and sped off, leaving behind only her glasses and a cell phone, which had fallen to the ground during the struggle. Within minutes, Carlesha had vanished. A passerby who witnessed the attack immediately called 911. When police arrived, they found shattered glass on the pavement and Carlesha's belongings scattered across the sidewalk. The surveillance footage provided them with crucial evidence. The kidnapper was male, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. The car was a 2002 Ford Taurus, dark in color, possibly gray or silver. Carlesha had fought viciously, leaving behind a trail of resistance. Her family was devastated. They knew Carlesha was tough and independent, but as the hours stretched on with no word, fear set in. Her mother, Keisha Freeland-Gaither, pleaded for her safe return. "I just want my daughter back. Whoever took her, please bring her back." As police worked to track down the car and suspect, they had no idea just how dangerous the man they were dealing with truly was. As hours passed with no contact from Carlesha's captor, the search effort escalated. Police combed through every lead, using surveillance footage, witness statements, and phone records to track down her abductor. The video footage of the kidnapping was widely shared, and tips began flooding in. By early morning, detectives identified the vehicle used in the abduction. a 2002 Ford Taurus. But they still had no clear suspect. Then, just as hope began to wane, a breakthrough came. A tip led investigators to a man named Carol Wayne West, a 51-year-old with a criminal history. He was not a random attacker, but someone with a history of violent behavior, including charges for assault and other offenses. Though the investigation into West's background painted a dark picture, it wasn't enough to immediately tie him to the crime. That would come later, but the timeline of his known whereabouts and his connection to Karlesha's abduction was starting to form. Carol Wayne West was not unfamiliar to the authorities. His past included multiple arrests, including one for sexual assault in 1994. He had also been charged with kidnapping in the past, though he had never been convicted. Detectives learned that West had a long history of violent tendencies, and his actions that night seemed to mirror his past offenses. He was known to be unpredictable, and his behavior had escalated in recent years. It was clear that West had carefully planned the kidnapping. He knew the area, and he had likely been watching Karlesha for some time, waiting for the right moment to strike. What made this case even more chilling was West's methodical approach. He had carefully prepared for the abduction, and it seemed as though he had anticipated the police response. As they followed his trail, West managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities for several days. As the police search grew more urgent, they focused on areas where West was known to frequent. They checked his last known locations, his possible connections, and his history of violent outbursts. They even examined his mobile phone records, looking for any clues that could lead them to Karlesha. Meanwhile, Karlesha's family remained on edge, clinging to the hope that she would be found safe. The tension was palpable as the investigation seemed to stall. It became increasingly difficult to tell whether Karlesha was still alive, or whether she had fallen victim to her captor's violent tendencies. The search for Karlesha Freelandgather had dragged on for days, and with each passing hour, hope seemed to be slipping away. But then, a critical break in the case came that would set everything in motion. In the early morning hours of November 4th, 2014, a manhunt led the authorities to Carol Wayne West's apartment in West Philadelphia, a place investigators had previously overlooked in their search. Police had received new information that put West in the area, and they were now closing in. Officers arrived at the apartment complex, hoping to find Karlesha and take West into custody. When they knocked on the door, it was clear that someone was inside, but there was no response. They forced entry into the apartment, and what they found shocked them. The apartment was eerily quiet, but it became immediately clear that West was not alone. Inside the apartment, investigators found Karlesha Freelandgather, still alive but terrified and injured. She was found sitting on the floor, her hands bound, and her face bruised from the ordeal. She had endured several days in captivity at the hands of Carol Wayne West. But the fact that she was alive was a testament to her strength and to the tireless efforts of the police. Karlesha's emotions were mixed. Relief, fear, and confusion. Yet, she was also grateful to be alive. She was taken immediately to a local hospital for treatment, and to ensure that she was not in any immediate danger, doctors reported that, though she had been physically harmed, she was in surprisingly good condition given the circumstances. For Karlesha's family, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The news of her discovery spread quickly, and the relief was palpable. While Karlesha was being treated, the police began to close in on Carol Wayne West. After a search of his apartment, they found evidence that linked him directly to the kidnapping. It was clear that West had been carefully planning his crime, and now he was being held accountable for his actions. West was arrested on charges of kidnapping, assault, and other offenses related to the abduction. His arrest marked the beginning of a legal battle that would expose the depths of his violent tendencies and his history of committing violent acts. But for Karlesha and her family, this was just the beginning. Though Karlesha had been found, the effects of the trauma she had experienced would take time to heal. Karlesha's recovery was not just physical, but also emotional. As she began to heal, she worked with authorities to help them piece together the events of her abduction. Her bravery in sharing her story would help investigators understand how Carol Wayne West had planned and executed the kidnapping. West's trial day revealed just how carefully he had orchestrated the abduction. He had studied the area, learned about Karlesha's routine, and meticulously planned his attack. During the trial, it was revealed that he had been stalking Karlesha for weeks before kidnapping her. His defense attorneys tried to argue that he had been acting under the influence of mental illness, but the prosecution painted a picture of a predatory individual who had carefully selected his victim and executed the crime with a chilling level of precision. Karlesha's bravery throughout the trial became a symbol of her strength and resilience. She faced the man who had held her captive and was determined to ensure that he would not hurt anyone else. In the end, Carol Wayne West was convicted of kidnapping and assault. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fitting punishment for the crimes he had committed. The trial's conclusion brought some semblance of closure to Karlesha and her family, but it was clear that the long-term impact of the abduction would stay with her forever. Story 4. The Heist of the Century. On August 6, 2005, one of the most audacious heists in history took place in Fortaleza, Brazil. The target was the Banco Central, the country's central bank, and the operation was so meticulously planned that it stunned law enforcement and the public alike. This case would become infamous as the Banco Central burglary, a daring robbery that involved a group of criminals stealing over $70 million USD, around 160 million Brazilian reais. The sheer scale of the heist, combined with its flawless execution, led it to be regarded as one of the most impressive criminal operations in the world. The robbers had devised a plan so elaborate that it spanned months of preparation. At the heart of their strategy was the construction of an underground tunnel that would lead directly into the bank's vault. But the criminals didn't simply break in from a nearby street. Instead, they took advantage of a rented property that was positioned directly behind the Banco Central building. The first step in the plan was acquiring this property, which the criminals had done by posing as legitimate businessmen. The house, a single-story building, was unremarkable at first glance, but it was perfectly positioned to serve as a base for digging the tunnel. Once the location was secured, the burglars got to work. For 3 months, they dug the tunnel under the cover of darkness. The tunnel itself was a marvel of engineering. It was over 78 meters, 250 feet long, 1.5 meters, 5 feet high, and 80 centimeters, 31 inches wide. It was long enough to run underneath the street, cross beneath the police station, and eventually emerge inside the central bank itself. The burglars knew they would have to be discreet, so they worked carefully at night, ensuring no one noticed the tunnel's construction. They also managed to avoid detection by making sure that the construction equipment and materials didn't raise suspicions in the neighborhood. The criminals behind the heist were not ordinary thieves. They were highly skilled and experienced in their craft. The group, which included engineers, diggers, and experts in various fields, was carefully organized. They understood the layout of the Banco Central, having spent months surveying the bank and collecting detailed information about the building's security systems. Additionally, they had connections within the construction industry that allowed them to procure materials and tools needed to build the tunnel. Interestingly, the criminals were so well prepared that they even anticipated the bank's security measures, which included sophisticated alarm systems and reinforced vaults. To counter this, they devised a plan to disable the alarm systems temporarily, ensuring that the heist could proceed without interference. As the construction of the tunnel continued, the thieves maintained a low profile, living in the rented property and using the cover of night to continue their work. But, as with any ambitious plan, their time was running out. The heist needed to be executed with precision, and every detail had to be perfect. The day of the heist, August 6, 2005, was set to become one of the most remarkable chapters in criminal history. As the sun set over Fortaleza, Brazil, the robbers had completed months of careful planning and were ready to execute their meticulously devised operation. The day began with the criminals hiding in plain sight, operating as a well-coordinated team who seemed like nothing more than ordinary people. To execute the Banco Central burglary, the robbers relied on their extensive knowledge of the central bank's layout. Months of surveillance, detailed notes, and insider information had paid off. They knew the exact positioning of the vaults, security systems, and key access points within the building. Their final preparations began hours before the heist. Before entering the vault, the criminals disabled the alarm systems with precision. The team had already anticipated the bank's security features and had designed a way to circumvent them. The robbers had even gone as far as infiltrating the bank's phone lines, so they could prevent any immediate distress signals from reaching law enforcement. The most impressive feat of all was the underground tunnel they had painstakingly dug over the course of 3 months. The tunnel, which started from the back of a rented property and snaked its way underground, finally emerged inside the Banco Central, right beneath the vault. With the tunnel in place, the robbers were able to enter the bank unnoticed. Once inside the bank, the robbers made their way through the labyrinth of halls, using their pre-established knowledge of the building's design to avoid detection. They had one singular objective: the vault, which contained over 160 million Brazilian reais, approximately $70 million USD. To access the vault, the criminals had to get past a series of obstacles. The vault itself was reinforced with steel doors and sophisticated security mechanisms. However, the criminals had an inside advantage. Having carefully studied the bank's security system, they knew precisely when the vault would be unlocked and how to disarm the security systems briefly. It is said that the robbers used a professional locksmith to gain access to the vault, carefully bypassing its highly advanced security features. They didn't rush the job, knowing that each minute mattered. The team worked efficiently, ensuring that they weren't caught off guard. With the vault now open, the robbers had access to the millions of dollars in cash. But their work was far from over. The real challenge now lay in removing the money from the vault without arousing suspicion or triggering any alarms. Once the vault was cracked open and the money secured, the robbers went to work transporting the cash. They had planned for this moment too, bringing in large sacks and bags to carry the money. The criminals worked swiftly, taking advantage of the fact that they had several hours before anyone would realize what was happening. They loaded the bags of cash into the tunnel, using the very path they had created during months of preparation. As the burglars made their way back through the underground tunnel, they knew they had only one chance to get away. Timing was critical. If they moved too slowly or made any mistakes, they risked detection. They had prepared an escape route that led them directly to the rented property. The criminals had arranged for vehicles to wait nearby, ensuring a fast getaway once they were out of the bank. Once the criminals had escaped with the money, they split up, heading in different directions to further avoid detection. They had successfully completed one of the most elaborate heists in history, stealing millions of dollars from one of Brazil's most secure institutions. The following morning, as employees arrived at the Banco Central in Fortaleza, they were met with a shocking sight. The vault, once secure, had been completely breached. An alarm was immediately triggered, sending officials into a panic. The authorities were quickly alerted, and law enforcement swarmed the building, desperate to understand what had happened. At first, investigators were puzzled. There was no obvious sign of forced entry, and the security cameras had been tampered with, leaving behind little evidence. The robbers had covered their tracks meticulously, leaving no obvious clues as to how they had gained access to the vault or where they had gone after the heist. Investigators began questioning the bank's staff and conducting forensic analysis of the crime scene. But despite the best efforts of the police, there was very little to go on. It appeared as though the criminals had managed to pull off the heist without leaving behind a single trace. As the investigation continued, a critical breakthrough came when investigators discovered the underground tunnel that the robbers had used to enter the bank. It was located beneath a nearby rented property, and it quickly became clear that the criminals had planned this heist for months. They had dug the tunnel in secrecy, going to great lengths to avoid detection. The fact that the criminals had bypassed security systems and dug a tunnel to infiltrate the bank stunned the authorities. It became evident that the heist was not a random act of violence, but rather a well-coordinated and meticulously planned operation. Investigators began to piece together the extent of the planning that had gone into the burglary, and they realized they were dealing with a highly organized criminal enterprise. After completing the heist, the criminals had managed to escape the area without leaving behind much evidence. They had split up into separate vehicles, further complicating the investigation. But the authorities were not giving up easily. With the sheer scale of the crime, they pulled together all available resources, including investigators, surveillance teams, and specialized personnel to track down the robbers. The criminals had planned their escape routes in advance, knowing that it would take time before anyone realized the magnitude of the theft. They knew they had a brief window of time before the authorities could fully mobilize, but they had underestimated one key factor: the persistent efforts of law enforcement. Despite the robbers' meticulous planning, the investigation began to gain momentum. A breakthrough occurred when police began investigating the rented property, where the tunnel had originated. As they scrutinized the property and surrounding area, investigators discovered that the individuals involved in the operation had ties to the criminal underworld and had carefully coordinated their escape routes. Through a combination of forensic evidence and intelligence gathering, the police were able to identify a group of suspects who had been involved in the heist. Some were seasoned criminals with prior records, while others were more elusive figures with connections to organized crime syndicates. The investigation took months, but authorities slowly began to close in on the criminals responsible. They identified key members of the group as well as their roles in the heist. Some had acted as lookouts, while others had been directly involved in the planning and execution of the robbery. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement made a series of arrests. The criminals had underestimated the persistence of the authorities, who had used surveillance, undercover operations, and forensic analysis to trace the stolen money and pinpoint the individuals involved. In total, 25 individuals were arrested in connection with the heist, including key members of the group who had masterminded the operation. While some of the robbers had already fled the country by the time of their arrest, others were captured in Brazil and brought to trial. The police discovered that the stolen money had been laundered through a network of illegal businesses and offshore accounts. While a significant portion of the stolen funds were recovered, much of the money had been transferred out of the country, making it difficult for authorities to track down every cent. The arrests of the criminal group sent shockwaves through Brazil and beyond. The Banco Central burglary had been one of the largest heists in history, and the authorities were determined to bring those responsible to justice. The trial that followed was highly publicized, with media outlets covering every aspect of the case. The defendants faced numerous charges, including theft, conspiracy, and money laundering. Despite the criminal sophistication of the operation, the authorities were able to present solid evidence against the robbers, leading to convictions for several key members of the group. As the trial concluded, the criminals were sentenced to long prison terms. Many of the ringleaders received decades-long sentences, while others were given lighter sentences due to their roles in the crime. Despite the sentences, the criminals' daring escape and careful execution of the heist would remain a testament to their audacity and organizational skills. Story 5. On the 15th of April, 2013, the streets of Boston were filled with excitement as thousands gathered to participate in the 117th Boston Marathon. It is one of the oldest and most prestigious marathons in the world, and the atmosphere was electric with spectators cheering on the runners. The finish line at Boylston Street was a sight to behold, with crowds lining the streets, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the marathon's champions. The city was buzzing with energy, and many people from around the world had traveled to Boston to witness the iconic event. However, what should have been a day of celebration quickly turned into one of horror. Around 2:49 p.m., just under 3 hours after the race began, the first bomb exploded near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, sending shockwaves through the crowd. The blast was deafening, followed moments later by a second explosion just 13 seconds later, and about 210 yards away. Further down Boylston Street, people screamed in panic, and the festive atmosphere quickly turned into chaos. The two bombs left a path of devastation. Runners, spectators, and first responders were all caught in the deadly blasts. The bombings were not only a shock to those present at the scene, but also a direct attack on the spirit of the marathon, an event that symbolizes human perseverance and the triumph of the human spirit. Both explosions were made with pressure cookers filled with explosives, nails, and ball bearings designed to maximize casualties. These were crude yet highly effective bombs, chosen for their ability to cause indiscriminate destruction in a crowded, high-profile area. The immediate aftermath was nothing short of chaotic. Bloodied victims were scattered across the street, some with severe injuries while others were killed outright. Emergency medical teams were on the scene almost immediately, aided by law enforcement officers and volunteers. The nearby medical tent, which had been set up for the marathon runners, quickly became a makeshift triage center as victims flooded in. The authorities were faced with a critical situation. The bombings had been carried out in a densely populated area, and there was no way of knowing if additional bombs had been planted or if other attacks were imminent. As the explosions rocked the heart of Boston, the city's law enforcement and emergency response teams scrambled to secure the area, clear the wounded, and ensure no further bombs had been planted in the vicinity. The city went into lockdown mode as the Boston Police Department, along with the FBI, ATF, and other agencies, converged on the scene. The streets were quickly closed off and nearby buildings were evacuated. The severity of the attack had left the city on edge, but the people of Boston demonstrated their resilience, showing their bravery in the face of tragedy. 3 people lost their lives that day. Martin Richard, an 8-year-old boy, Crystal Campbell, a 29-year-old restaurant manager, and Lu Lingxi, a 23-year-old graduate student from China. In addition to the fatalities, over 260 others were injured, with many suffering from life-altering wounds. Some were left with missing limbs, while others were severely burned or injured by the shrapnel from the bombs. It was clear that the consequences of this attack would ripple throughout the city and beyond. In the wake of the attack, authorities began working to identify the perpetrators. As with any terrorist attack, there was a sense of urgency to find out who was responsible and prevent further attacks. The investigation began with interviews from witnesses, video footage from security cameras, and photos taken by bystanders. Within hours, authorities had a general idea of where the bombs had been placed, but they still had no idea who was behind the attack or why it had happened. As investigators combed through the scene, they realized that the Boston Marathon bombings were part of a larger plot. Evidence began to suggest that the attackers had meticulously planned the bombings and had taken great care in executing them. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a coordinated, premeditated terrorist attack designed to inflict maximum damage and cause widespread fear. Federal, state, and local authorities quickly teamed up to investigate the attack, with the FBI taking the lead due to the terrorist nature of the bombings. Early on, investigators focused on any leads or patterns that might point to a specific individual or group. They scoured security footage from surrounding buildings and interviewed witnesses who may have seen anything suspicious. At first, the investigation was slow, as many of the leads came up empty. But as the hours passed, the authorities began to piece together clues that would eventually lead them to the 2 men responsible. The bombs used in the attack were pressure cooker devices, which had been packed with explosive material, nails, and ball bearings. These devices were designed to cause maximum carnage by scattering shrapnel in every direction. The use of pressure cookers was a tactic that had been employed by other terrorists around the world, but its execution in such a public and high-profile attack was unprecedented in the United States. In the aftermath, the bombs were analyzed by experts in bomb disposal and counterterrorism. The authorities discovered that the bombs had been relatively simple to construct, yet highly effective. This indicated that the attackers had a working knowledge of explosives, which pointed to the possibility that the bombers had some form of training or experience with bomb-making techniques. In the days following the bombing, investigators began to examine the photographs and video footage from the scene. They quickly realized that there were images of 2 suspects who appeared to be walking near the scene of the explosions. The FBI released these images to the public, asking for help identifying the individuals. This marked the beginning of a manhunt that would dominate the national and international news. The images showed 2 men, later identified as Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, who were both suspects in the bombings. As authorities began to track down the Tsarnaev brothers, they learned that the pair had ties to Chechnya and had come to the U.S. as refugees. Tamerlan, the older of the 2, had spent time overseas and had shown signs of radicalization. His younger brother Dzhokhar, had lived a more normal life, attending college at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. The bombs had been placed with the intention of causing the most harm possible, and the brothers had carefully chosen the timing of the explosions to coincide with the Boston Marathon, an event that would guarantee widespread media coverage and public attention. As the investigation continued to unfold, the city of Boston was thrust into a state of fear and uncertainty. The authorities were determined to catch the suspects before they could strike again. But the Tsarnaev brothers were already on the move. The authorities' next steps would lead them into a violent manhunt that would span several days, culminating in a dramatic confrontation. After the release of the security footage showing two men near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, the FBI quickly identified the suspects. They were able to match images of the brothers with a driver's license photo of Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and from there, they began piecing together the brothers' history. Tamerlan, the older of the two, had lived in the United States for over a decade and had been involved in several activities that raised suspicions among authorities. He had attended a local mosque in Boston and had reportedly made several statements that indicated his growing radicalization. Dzhokhar, his younger brother, had been living a relatively normal life as a student at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. He was described by peers as a friendly and easygoing young man, but his connection to his older brother became increasingly evident as the investigation unfolded. The FBI and local law enforcement began to trace the Tsarnaev brothers' movements in the days leading up to the bombings. They found that the two had been actively preparing for the attack, purchasing materials for the bombs, and carrying out reconnaissance on possible targets. Their plan had been executed with precision, and it was clear that they had been determined to carry out the attack no matter the cost. On the night of April 18th, 2013, a break in the case came when a police officer was shot and killed in a violent confrontation with the Tsarnaev brothers. The two men, desperate to escape, ambushed a police officer, fatally wounding him, and carjacked a vehicle in the process. The robbery of the vehicle led to a high-speed chase that ended in a confrontation with law enforcement. By now, the brothers had become the most wanted criminals in America, and the authorities were determined to bring them to justice. The city of Boston was placed under lockdown as thousands of officers searched for the suspects. Residents were instructed to stay indoors, while police searched every street and building in the surrounding area. The Tsarnaev brothers' plan had begun to unravel. They were no longer anonymous, and they had nowhere to hide, but despite their increasingly desperate attempts to flee, the authorities were closing in on them. It was clear that the brothers would not go down without a fight, and the next chapter of this dramatic pursuit would soon unfold. On the evening of April 19, 2013, the Tsarnaev brothers were spotted in the town of Watertown, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. Law enforcement had received a tip-off and had surrounded the area, hoping to catch the suspects before they could escape again. It was here that the confrontation between the brothers and the police reached its terrifying climax. As police approached the brothers' vehicle, a violent gunfight ensued. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older brother, opened fire on officers, and the situation quickly escalated into a full-blown shootout. The streets of Watertown were filled with the sound of gunfire as the two men fought back with everything they had. Tamerlan was killed in the exchange of fire, but Dzhokhar managed to escape on foot, fleeing into the nearby neighborhood. The shootout marked a turning point in the search for the brothers. With Tamerlan dead, Dzhokhar was now the focus of the authorities' efforts. The search for him turned into an all-out manhunt, with police combing through Watertown and surrounding areas, conducting door-to-door searches and questioning residents. The lockdown remained in place, and the entire city of Boston held its breath, waiting for news of the capture. As night fell on April 19th, the authorities continued to search for Dzhokhar. With the entire city in lockdown, residents were urged to remain in their homes, while law enforcement conducted the most intense search in the city's history. The manhunt stretched into the early hours of April 20th, 2013, with Dzhokhar still at large. Then, around 6:00 p.m., a breakthrough came. A resident of Watertown noticed something unusual in his backyard. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was hiding in a boat parked in the yard, and the homeowner immediately contacted the police. Officers surrounded the area, and after several tense hours, Jokar was captured without further violence. The news that Jokar had been apprehended brought an overwhelming sense of relief to the city of Boston. The manhunt was officially over, and the people of Boston could begin the process of healing. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was taken into custody and charged with the bombing that had left 3 people dead and over 260 injured. The capture of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev marked the end of the immediate danger, but it was only the beginning of a long legal battle. The people of Boston, as well as the entire nation, were left to deal with the psychological scars of the attack. The victims of the bombing had been physically and emotionally scarred, and the city was forced to confront the reality that it had been the target of an act of terrorism. In the days that followed, memorials and tributes were held in honor of those who had lost their lives, and the survivors began their long road to recovery. The Boston Marathon would forever be marked by the events of that day, and the city's resilience in the face of terror became a symbol of hope for many across the world. The trial officially began in March 2015. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was charged with a wide range of crimes, including the use of a weapon of mass destruction, the murder of a federal officer, and multiple counts of attempted murder and terrorism. The case was closely followed by the media, with many questioning the motives behind the bombing and the appropriate punishment for the young man who had been involved in such a horrific act. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's fate would rest in the hands of the jury. In April 2015, after deliberating for several weeks, the jury convicted Tsarnaev on all 30 charges, including murder and terrorism. During the sentencing phase, the jury was tasked with deciding whether Tsarnaev would receive the death penalty or life in prison. The jury deliberated for several days, and in May 2015, they ultimately reached a verdict. Tsarnaev was sentenced to death, though this decision would later be appealed. Though the sentencing of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev was a significant chapter in the story, the legal proceedings continued long after the trial ended. His death sentence, however, was overturned in 2020, and his case remains a topic of legal and public debate. Story 6. The beginning of a deadly partnership. On the 6th of September 1987, a chilling confession was made that would unravel a dark and twisted story of betrayal, violence, and a sinister bond between 2 women. Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine May Wood, both young women working as nurses at the Alpine Manor nursing home in Michigan, found themselves at the center of a case that would shock the nation. The murders they committed were not of the spontaneous nature one might expect, but rather carefully calculated acts carried out over the span of several months. Gwendolyn Graham, a 25-year-old nurse's aide, and Catherine May Wood, a 23-year-old nurse, formed a bond while working at the Alpine Manor nursing home. It was here that the seeds of violence were sown. Both women, seemingly ordinary, were well liked by their colleagues, but beneath the surface, something darker began to emerge. Graham and Wood became romantically involved with each other, a relationship that, as it would later emerge, would develop into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The 2 women would spend long hours together in the nursing home, and it was in these hours that they began to discuss, and eventually act on, their twisted desire for control, power, and ultimately, murder. Over time, they would carry out their plan to kill elderly women residing in the care of the facility, believing that their victims would be forgotten in the process. Victims that would not be missed or mourned by family members. The first murder attributed to Graham and Wood took place in 1987, when they killed their first victim, an elderly woman named Barbara Blatnick. Barbara, a patient at Alpine Manor, was known to be frail and in poor health. Her death was initially ruled as a natural occurrence, attributed to her declining health. However, as the investigation would reveal later, this would not be the last time the 2 women would take the lives of the elderly. Graham and Wood took advantage of their positions at the nursing home to commit their crimes. They knew that the elderly residents under their care were often overlooked, and their deaths would not be questioned or thoroughly investigated. The 2 women began a secret killing spree that would last for several months, taking advantage of the vulnerability of their victims. They used suffocation as their method of choice, believing that it was a quiet and inconspicuous way to end the lives of those under their care. Though it seemed like a methodical and precise way to carry out their murders, the question remained: what drove these women to commit such heinous acts? Was it purely a thirst for power and control, or was there something deeper that pushed them toward murder? By early 1988, Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine May Wood had killed several women. However, they were not satisfied with the quiet nature of their murders. At one point, they began to boast to their colleagues about what they had done. They told stories about the power they felt when taking the lives of their victims, discussing how easy it was to slip unnoticed into their rooms at the nursing home. But the act of killing soon grew more difficult to keep secret. Wood began to feel the guilt and weight of what they had done. She became paranoid about getting caught, and her mental state began to deteriorate. After confessing to her partner, Graham, Wood eventually came forward with the truth. On September 6, 1987, she confessed to her role in the murders, telling authorities everything about the killings, and implicating Graham as her accomplice. Wood's confession would send shockwaves through the small community in Michigan, and the discovery of Graham and Wood's crimes would soon become national news. The police would now need to investigate whether there were other victims in addition to the ones already discovered, and how far their deadly partnership had gone. The authorities began their investigation by interviewing Wood, who provided an in-depth account of the murders and her involvement. Wood revealed that she and Graham had formed a deadly partnership, targeting elderly women who were under their care. As the investigation progressed, it became evident that the women had carefully selected their victims, choosing those who were frail and vulnerable. Wood explained how the murders were committed. The women would often work the night shift at Alpine Manor, allowing them to access the patients' rooms without being noticed. They used pillows to suffocate their victims, ensuring that the deaths would appear natural due to the frailty of the elderly residents. It was a cruel and calculated act of murder, carried out with chilling precision. As the authorities delved deeper into the investigation, they realized that several deaths at Alpine Manor had gone unnoticed or been attributed to natural causes. The murders were not isolated incidents, but rather a systematic pattern of killings that had been taking place for months. The authorities now had to piece together the puzzle of how many women had died at the hands of Graham and Wood. One of the most intriguing aspects of the case was trying to understand what motivated Graham and Wood to commit such heinous acts. As the investigation progressed, psychological evaluations of both women were conducted. What emerged from these evaluations painted a disturbing picture of the two women's mental states. Gwendolyn Graham, who was described as having a history of emotional instability, seemed to have been driven by a desire for power and control. She had a troubled childhood and had struggled with relationships throughout her life. Her relationship with Catherine May Wood appeared to provide her with a sense of emotional validation, but it was also a destructive and toxic bond that led to murder. Catherine May Wood, on the other hand, was described as more vulnerable and emotionally fragile. She had a history of low self-esteem and had been struggling with mental health issues. It was this instability that led to her eventual breakdown and confession. Wood's feelings of guilt and paranoia ultimately led her to reveal the truth about the murders, but it was clear that she was deeply conflicted about the crimes. The psychological profiles of both women provided insight into their motivations and their dangerous bond. It was clear that their relationship had played a significant role in their descent into murder. The power dynamics between them were complex, with Graham acting as the dominant figure and Wood following her lead, despite her reservations. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to identify the victims of Graham and Wood. Several elderly women who had died at Alpine Manor were found to have been murdered, though their deaths had been initially ruled as natural causes. The authorities, now armed with the information from Wood's confession, began to exhumate bodies and re-examine the deaths of other patients at the nursing home. Among the first victims identified were Barbara Blatnick and Helen Voss, two elderly women who had died under suspicious circumstances. Their deaths, which had initially been written off as the result of natural causes, were now being investigated as potential homicides. It was discovered that both women had been suffocated with pillows, just like the other victims. The authorities now had a clearer picture of the extent of the murders and the method used by the killers. As the investigation progressed, It was revealed that Graham and Wood had murdered at least 5 women at Alpine Manor over the course of several months. These women had been selected because they were vulnerable, and their deaths would not be immediately questioned. The nursing home, which had failed to notice the pattern of deaths, was now under scrutiny, and questions began to arise about how these murders had gone undetected for so long. In the following months, the case against Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine May Wood began to take shape. Both women were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. Their trial would be a sensational event, as the nation was horrified by the brutality of their crimes and the fact that they had been committed by 2 women who were supposed to care for the elderly. Graham and Wood's defense teams tried to portray them as victims of their troubled pasts, seeking to mitigate their involvement in the murders. However, the prosecution argued that both women had acted with malice and premeditation, targeting elderly women who could not defend themselves. The details of their relationship were also central to the trial, with the prosecution suggesting that their bond had been a toxic influence that led them down a deadly path. The trial, which took place in the early 1990s, ended with both women being convicted of murder. Gwendolyn Graham was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Catherine May Wood was sentenced to 20 to 60 years in prison. Both women would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, paying the price for their horrific crimes. Story 7. A Thanksgiving Nightmare. On November 22, 2018, Thanksgiving Day, Kelsey Barrett, a 29-year-old flight instructor and devoted mother, was seen for the last time. Surveillance footage captured her entering a Safeway grocery store in Woodland Park, Colorado, with her 1-year-old daughter, Kaylee. She appeared calm, carrying a basket while wearing a light gray sweater and jeans. Just a few hours later, Kelsey's fiancé, Patrick Frazee, claimed she dropped Kaylee off with him and left, never to be seen again. Days passed with no sign of Kelsey. Her phone was mysteriously active 800 miles away in Idaho, sending text to her employer and to Fraze. But something was wrong. Her messages lacked their usual tone, and her family quickly grew suspicious. As the investigation unfolded, police uncovered a chilling and calculated crime that would shock the nation. Kelsey Barrett was the kind of woman who seemed to have everything together. Born and raised in Washington State, she was known for her intelligence, kindness, and quiet determination. She had earned her pilot's license and was working as a flight instructor while raising her young daughter. She had met Patrick Frazee, a Colorado rancher, in 2016. The two became engaged and soon welcomed Kaylee, their daughter. But their relationship was far from perfect. Though engaged, Kelsey and Patrick never lived together, and friends noticed tension between them. Still, no one expected that Kelsey's life would come to such a tragic and violent end. On the morning of November 22, 2018, Kelsey texted Patrick, asking if he wanted to watch a video on baking sweet potato casserole, a seemingly normal holiday conversation. That afternoon, she was seen on surveillance footage at Safeway with Kaylee. After that, she seemingly vanished. Patrick later told investigators that Kelsey dropped Kaylee off at his ranch, saying she needed a break. He claimed she then sent him a text message saying, "I won't be coming back." At first, Patrick insisted that Kelsey had left voluntarily, but as days turned into weeks, her family grew increasingly concerned. Kelsey's mother, Cheryl Barrett, reported her missing on December 2, 2018, after failing to reach her daughter for over a week. That's when investigators uncovered a disturbing series of clues that pointed to something far more sinister. On November 25th, 3 days after Kelsey was last seen, a text was sent from her phone to her employer at DOS Aviation, where she worked as a flight instructor. The message said she would be coming into work. Another message was sent to Patrick Frazee, but what raised alarm bells was the location data. Kelsey's phone pinged in Gooding, Idaho, nearly 800 miles away from her home in Colorado. How could she have gotten there so fast? And why? Investigators soon discovered that Kelsey's phone was not in her possession. Someone else had taken it, and as they traced its movements, they uncovered a secret connection that would lead them to the truth. Kelsey Barrett's phone had last pinged in Gooding, Idaho, nearly 800 miles from her home in Woodland Park, Colorado. Investigators traced the phone's movements and uncovered a disturbing connection. Crystal Lee Kenny, a nurse from Twin Falls, Idaho, had received the phone after Kelsey's disappearance. Crystal wasn't just a random stranger. She was Patrick Fraze's secret girlfriend. When questioned, she admitted to disposing of Kelsey's phone at Fraze's request. But that was just the beginning of what she had to say. Under police questioning, Crystal Kenny made a bombshell confession. She revealed that Fraze had been plotting Kelsey's murder for months, and that she had been involved in multiple failed attempts to kill her. Crystal claimed that between September and November 2018, Fraze had pressured her to kill Kelsey herself on 3 separate occasions. He gave her instructions to poison Kelsey's coffee, but each time, Crystal backed out. When Crystal failed to go through with it, Fraze took matters into his own hands. On November 22, 2018, Fraze allegedly told Crystal, "I took care of it." What came next was horrifying. Crystal claimed that on Thanksgiving Day, after Kelsey returned home from the grocery store, Patrick Fraze arrived at her townhouse under the guise of picking up their daughter, Kaylee. The moment Kelsey turned her back, Fraze brutally attacked her with a baseball bat, striking her multiple times in the head. But the most disturbing part, Fraze forced his own infant daughter to be in the room as he committed the crime. He later claimed that Kelsey had never been a good mother and that Kaylee wouldn't remember what happened. After murdering Kelsey, Fraze wrapped her body in a black tote bag and left it inside the house. He then called Crystal Kenny and demanded that she drive from Idaho to Colorado to clean up the crime scene. Terrified but under Fraze's control, Crystal drove nearly 13 hours to Kelsey's townhouse. When she entered, she was met with a horrific sight. Kelsey's blood covered the floors, walls, and furniture. For hours, Crystal scrubbed the crime scene, using bleach and cleaning supplies to erase all evidence of the attack. Meanwhile, Fraze had taken Kelsey's body to his ranch, where he burned her remains in a large metal trough before disposing of them. Kelsey Barrett's body was never recovered. With Crystal Kenny's cooperation, authorities were able to piece together Fraze's actions leading up to and after Kelsey's murder. Investigators focused on several key pieces of evidence. Surveillance footage. Security cameras from Kelsey's townhouse complex captured Fraze entering and leaving her home on November 22, 2018. The day she was last seen alive. Cell phone data. Kelsey's phone had traveled to Idaho after her disappearance, a journey that matched Crystal's confession about disposing of it at Fraze's request. Blood evidence. Despite Crystal's attempt to clean the scene, forensic investigators used luminol to detect traces of Kelsey's blood in her home, particularly in the bathroom and living room. Witness testimonies. Friends and family of Kelsey testified that her relationship with Fraze had been strained, with him often making troubling comments about wanting her gone. Prosecutors were confident they had enough to take Fraze to trial, but Crystal Kenny's role in the crime complicated matters. Crystal had actively participated in covering up Kelsey's murder, but her testimony was crucial in securing a conviction. In exchange for her cooperation, she was offered a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence for cleaning up the crime scene. In return, she agreed to testify against Fraze. Her sentence was reduced to 3 years in prison. The deal sparked public outrage. Many believed Crystal should have faced harsher punishment, as she had known about Fraze's plans for months, and had even attempted to carry them out. Despite the controversy, her testimony proved invaluable in court. Patrick Fraze's trial began in November 2019. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence that he had meticulously planned and carried out Kelsey's murder, driven by a desire for full custody of their daughter. Crystal Kenny took the stand, recounting the chilling details of the murder, the cleanup, and the disposal of Kelsey's remains. She described how Fraze had tried to manipulate her into committing the crime herself, and later forced her to cover up his actions. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. Patrick Fraze was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge handed down the maximum sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years for charges, including solicitation of murder, and tampering with evidence. The aftermath of this case resulted in a number of extra charges, which includes Crystal Kenny, initially sentenced to 3 years in prison. She was released early in 2021, but was later resentenced to 10 years after public backlash. Kelsey's daughter. Now in the custody of Kelsey's parents, Kaylee is being raised away from the horrors of her father's actions. Kelsey's family. Her loved ones have continued to advocate for victims of domestic violence, ensuring that her story is never forgotten. The case of Kelsey Barrett remains a heartbreaking reminder of how intimate partner violence can escalate to deadly levels, but also a testament to the perseverance of law enforcement and the fight for justice. Story 8. A Stolen Life. On the morning of July 10, 1998, in Jacksonville, Florida, Shannara Mobley arrived at University Medical Center to give birth to her first child. It was a moment of pure joy for the 16-year-old mother, who had been eagerly awaiting the arrival of her baby girl, Camilla. But just hours later, the joy turned into unimaginable heartbreak. A woman posing as a nurse walked into Shannara's hospital room, took the newborn into her arms, and walked out of the hospital, disappearing without a trace. It was the beginning of a case that would haunt Shannara for nearly 2 decades and shock the nation when the truth finally came to light. That morning, Shannara was still recovering from childbirth when a woman she believed to be a nurse entered her hospital room. She was dressed professionally in scrubs and had a comforting demeanor. The woman assured Shannara that Camilla needed a checkup and gently lifted the newborn from her mother's arms. Shannara thought nothing of it. Hospitals had procedures after all. But as the minutes turned into hours, she began to grow concerned. When no one returned with her baby, she alerted the nurses, who quickly realized something was terribly wrong. A frantic hospital-wide search ensued. The security footage showed a woman calmly walking out of the hospital, cradling baby Camilla in her arms. There was no sign of forced entry or struggle, just a well-executed abduction. By the time authorities were alerted, the woman had already vanished. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office and the FBI immediately launched an Amber Alert and began what would become one of the most high-profile child abduction cases in U.S. history. Investigators pieced together a description of the suspect based on witness accounts. African-American woman, mid-30s, dressed in hospital scrubs, confident and calm demeanor, seen carrying a white blanket around Camilla. The case gained national attention, with news stations broadcasting the baby's picture across the country. Investigators followed thousands of leads, but they all led to dead ends. There were no ransom demands, no additional sightings, and no apparent motive. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually, years passed without any answers. Shannara Mobley was devastated. She had given birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl, only to have her stolen within hours. The loss consumed her, and despite efforts from the police, she felt like her daughter had vanished forever. Every year on Camilla's birthday, Shannara made public pleas for her safe return. She struggled emotionally and financially, often expressing her heartbreak in interviews. The pain was unbearable, and she eventually sued the hospital for inadequate security, receiving a small settlement. But money could never replace her stolen child. Meanwhile, somewhere out there, Camilla was growing up under a different name, living a life far from the one she was meant to have. For years, the search for Camilla Mobley remained at a standstill. Despite thousands of tips and an FBI investigation, the case grew cold. But nearly 19 years later, an unexpected break changed everything. In 2016, a mysterious tip reached the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a claim that a teenage girl in South Carolina might be the missing Camilla Mobley. Investigators followed the lead, and what they uncovered would bring both relief and heartbreak to those who had waited for the truth. In late 2016, authorities in Jacksonville received a tip suggesting that a young woman named Alexis Manigo, living in Walterboro, South Carolina, may have been the kidnapped child. The information was vague, but it was enough to warrant an investigation. The FBI and Jacksonville authorities quietly began digging into Alexis' background. The first major red flag: she had no legal birth certificate or social security number. This was a common issue among people raised under false identities, As authorities continued their inquiry, they began focusing on the woman who raised Alexis, Gloria Williams. Gloria Williams was a 51-year-old woman who had been living in South Carolina for years. She was well liked in her community, worked as a social worker, and had a reputation for being a kind, caring mother. But beneath the surface, she carried a terrible secret. Back in 1998, Gloria had suffered a miscarriage. The loss devastated her, and in the months that followed, she became increasingly desperate. Friends recalled that she was emotionally unstable and withdrawn. Then, on July 10, 1998, she did something unthinkable. Wearing scrubs and pretending to be a nurse, she entered the Jacksonville hospital where Shannara Mobley had just given birth. Under the guise of routine medical care, she took Camilla from the hospital room and disappeared into the Florida heat. From that day forward, Camilla Mobley was raised as Alexis Manigault, never knowing the truth about her identity. By January 2017, investigators had gathered enough evidence to confirm what they had long suspected. Alexis Manigault was indeed Camilla Mobley. Authorities confronted Gloria Williams with the evidence. At first, she denied everything. But when the weight of the truth became unbearable, she finally confessed. She admitted to kidnapping Camilla, forging documents, and raising her under a false identity. Despite her confession, she insisted that she had loved Camilla and given her a good life. On January 13, 2017, Gloria Williams was arrested and charged with kidnapping and interference with custody. As news of her arrest spread, the world turned its attention to Camilla Mobley, who was about to face an unimaginable reality. When police arrived at her South Carolina home, 18-year-old Camilla was in complete shock. She had grown up believing Gloria Williams was her biological mother. She had a loving home, a stable life, and a future she had never questioned. Now, in an instant, everything was being ripped away. Camilla initially defended Gloria, expressing her love for the woman who had raised her. She was angry, confused, and torn between the truth and the only life she had ever known. Meanwhile, in Florida, Shannara Mobley was overwhelmed with emotions. After nearly 2 decades of pain and searching, she had finally found her daughter, but the reunion would not be as simple as she had hoped. After her arrest, Gloria Williams was extradited to Jacksonville, Florida, where she faced charges of kidnapping and interference with custody. Prosecutors made it clear, while Williams had raised Camilla well, her actions had caused irreparable harm to the Mobley family. Shannara Mobley, Camilla's biological mother, had spent nearly 2 decades searching for her child, experiencing unimaginable grief and trauma. As the case unfolded, Williams pleaded guilty to both charges. She expressed deep remorse, stating that she had acted out of desperation after suffering a miscarriage. In June 2018, the court sentenced Gloria Williams to 18 years in prison. Williams wept during the sentencing, apologizing to Shannara Mobley and the entire Mobley family. However, Shannara remained deeply hurt, stating that no apology could erase the pain of losing her child for nearly 2 decades. Story 9. A Fortune Gone Forever. On the night of February 21, 2006, in the quiet town of Tonbridge, Kent, England, the Securitas Cash Depot stood as one of the largest of its kind in the country, holding millions in banknotes. It was a high-security facility, protected by strict protocols and surveillance systems. But on the night of February 21, 2006, a gang of well-organized criminals launched an audacious plan, one that would lead to the largest cash robbery in British history. At the heart of this heist was a carefully orchestrated kidnapping, deception, and military-style precision that would see over 53 million pounds stolen in just a matter of hours. The heist began in the early evening when Colin Dixon, the 52-year-old manager of the Securitas Depot, was driving home from work. Unbeknownst to him, his car was being tailed. Around 6:30 p.m., a fake unmarked police car, equipped with flashing blue lights, signaled Dixon to pull over. 2 men, dressed in police uniforms, approached his vehicle. Dixon, believing it was a routine stop, complied. But before he could react, the men forcibly restrained him, placed him in their vehicle, and took him hostage. The criminals held the terrified family in an unknown location, using them as leverage to force Dixon's cooperation. With his family's safety at risk, Dixon had no choice but to comply with their demands. Shortly after 1:00 a.m., the gang arrived at the Securitas depot, forcing Dixon to let them inside. Once through the security doors, a nightmare unfolded for the employees. The gang, armed and masked, stormed the building, quickly subduing 14 staff members. They bound, gagged, and threatened the employees, warning them that any attempt to resist would result in harm. The criminal strategy was methodical and precise, showing they had studied the depot's layout and security measures in advance. One of the most crucial steps in their plan was disabling the depot's security systems. They forced Dixon to lead them to the vault, where millions of pounds in cash were stored. Unlike many other bank heists that focused on specific safes, this crew went for a more ambitious approach. They wanted to clear out as much cash as possible. Using large industrial containers, they began stuffing millions in banknotes into getaway vehicles. By the time the criminals left, they had stolen 53 pounds in cash, leaving behind the depot employees bound and terrified. Within hours, Britain had witnessed the largest cash robbery in history. The gang had executed their plan flawlessly. No alarms had been triggered, no shots had been fired, and they had managed to vanish into the night without immediate detection. Less than 24 hours after the heist, authorities received their first major lead. An abandoned white van was found in a rural area outside Tonbridge. Inside, police discovered some of the gang's disguises, along with plastic ties and other equipment used to restrain the depot workers. Forensic teams quickly analyzed the vehicle and retrieved crucial evidence, including DNA traces that would later prove vital in linking suspects to the crime. Meanwhile, police turned their attention to another angle. How did the robbers gain such detailed knowledge of the Securitas depot? It didn't take long for authorities to suspect that someone with inside knowledge of the depot's operations had played a key role. Their suspicions were soon confirmed when investigators uncovered a crucial link between the gang and the depot's security systems. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when police identified Johan Callan, a security insider who had been in contact with one of the gang members. He had been providing detailed information about the depot's routines, staff movements, and security weaknesses. This revelation tightened the noose around the suspects. As police followed this lead, they soon discovered another critical mistake made by the robbers. As the criminals celebrated their record-breaking haul, they began making mistakes that would cost them dearly. A few days after the heist, authorities intercepted a conversation between some of the suspects. One of the gang members had arranged a meeting with an associate, failing to realize that police were already monitoring their movements. That meeting provided a major break in the case, one that would lead investigators directly to the key players behind the heist. Through a combination of forensic evidence, surveillance footage, and intercepted communications, police were able to connect multiple individuals to the crime. Among those implicated were Lee Murray, a former MMA fighter suspected of masterminding the heist; Roger Coutts, a criminal with a history of armed robbery; Stuart Royal, a known associate of Murray. As the investigation gained momentum, it became clear that police were closing in on the entire operation. But there was still one major question left unanswered. Where was the money? One of the key masterminds behind the heist, Lee Murray, had anticipated the possibility of getting caught. In the days after the robbery, he used a fake passport to flee to Morocco, a country that had no extradition treaty with the UK. Authorities had already suspected Murray's involvement due to his criminal past, lavish spending, and connections to organized crime. Once he surfaced in Morocco, British investigators worked with Moroccan authorities to track him down. On June 25, 2006, Murray was arrested in Rabat, Morocco, while leaving a shopping mall. However, due to Morocco's citizenship laws, he was able to avoid extradition, forcing British authorities to find other ways to hold him accountable. Meanwhile, back in the UK, police had identified and arrested multiple members of the gang, including Roger Coutts, arrested after being linked to the stolen cash; Stuart Royal, caught through forensic evidence found in the abandoned getaway van; Immerse, a former security guard at the depot who had acted as the inside man. The trials that followed were highly publicized, as prosecutors worked to secure convictions Despite the lack of direct evidence linking some of the criminals to the actual robbery, in January 2008, multiple gang members were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, with some receiving over 15 years behind bars. Despite the arrests, a significant portion of the 53 million pounds was never recovered. Some of the money was found buried underground, while other portions had been moved through international criminal networks. To this day, a large sum remains missing, fueling speculation about whether other unknown accomplices might still be hiding part of the fortune. Story 10. Stephen Port. On the morning of June 19, 2014, a dog walker in Barking, East London, made a grim discovery near St. Margaret's Churchyard. The body of a young man, 23-year-old Anthony Walgety. At first glance, it seemed like an accidental drug overdose, but the truth behind his death would unravel a much more disturbing story. This was the beginning of a horrifying pattern. Over the next 15 months, 3 more men would be found dead under eerily similar circumstances, all within a half-mile radius. Their deaths were initially treated as unrelated drug overdoses, but in reality they were victims of a serial predator, Stephen Port. Born in 1975 in Southend-on-Sea, Essex, Stephen Port grew up in what seemed to be a typical middle-class household. Described by acquaintances as socially awkward, Port struggled with his sexual identity throughout his teenage years. By the time he reached adulthood, he had settled in Barking, East London, where he worked as a chef. Outwardly, he appeared harmless, a quiet, slightly eccentric man who was known for his boyish appearance and bleached blonde hair. However, beneath this seemingly assuming exterior lurked a predator with a sinister plan. Stephen Port's crimes began in June 2014, when he met 23-year-old Anthony Walgety, a fashion student from Hull who occasionally worked as an escort. Port arranged to meet Walgety under the pretense of paying him for his services. That night, Walgety was drugged with GHB, also known as the date rape drug. Port then left his body outside his apartment building, later calling 999 to report that he had found an unconscious man. Despite his suspicious behavior, Port was only charged with perverting the course of justice for lying about how he found Walgety. He served just 8 months in prison. Meanwhile, police failed to investigate how Walgety truly died, a failure that would prove catastrophic. 2 months after his release, Port struck again. Gabriel Kovari, a 25-year-old Slovakian student, had recently moved to London in search of a new life. He was last seen alive staying with Port at his Barking flat. On August 28, 2014, Kovari's body was discovered by the same dog walker who had found Walgety. He was propped up near a cemetery wall, his phone missing, and traces of GHB were later found in his system. Despite the unusual similarities to Walgety's death, police still did not link the cases. Just 3 weeks later, in September 2014, Port killed 21-year-old Daniel Whitworth, a chef from Kent. His body was found in the exact same spot as Kovari's, once again staged to appear as an overdose. This time, however, Port went a step further. He planted a fake suicide note in Whitworth's hand, which falsely claimed that he had given Kovari the drugs that killed him, and was now taking his own life out of guilt. Shockingly, police accepted the note as genuine without verifying its authenticity. Had they conducted a proper investigation, they would have discovered that Port had actually kept Whitworth's body in his apartment for several days before staging the scene. But instead, the case was closed, and Port remained free to kill again. By the end of 2014, 3 young men had died under suspiciously similar circumstances, all found in the same area, all overdosed on DHB, and all last seen alive with Stephen Port. Yet no connection was made by authorities. It was only when a 4th victim was discovered the following year that police finally began to suspect something far more sinister was at play. On the morning of September 14, 2015, the grim pattern continued. Another young man was found dead near St. Margaret's Churchyard in Barking. 25-year-old Jack Taylor. He was found slumped against a wall, eerily similar to the 3 previous victims. Like the others, Taylor had been overdosed with DHB. For over a year, police had dismissed these deaths as unrelated drug overdoses, failing to recognize the clear pattern linking them all. But this time, Jack Taylor's family refused to accept the explanation. Their determination to uncover the truth would finally expose Stephen Port's horrifying crimes. Jack Taylor, a forklift truck driver from Dagenham, was a kind-hearted and fun-loving young man. Unlike Port's previous victims, Taylor was not involved in escorting or casual hookups. He was simply looking for friendship online. On the night of September 12, 2015, he met Stephen Port on Grindr. Port lured Taylor to his apartment under the pretense of having a few drinks together. But as with his previous victims, Port had a much darker plan. That night, Taylor was drugged with GHB and lost consciousness. As the drugs took effect, Port injected him with more powerful sedatives, ensuring he wouldn't wake up. Hours later, Taylor was dead. Instead of calling for help, Port dragged his body outside and staged the scene just as he had before. He placed a bottle of GHB beside him and positioned his body to make it seem like an overdose. Unlike previous cases, Taylor's death did not go unnoticed. His family immediately suspected foul play. They knew Jack wasn't a drug user, and the circumstances surrounding his death felt too suspicious. The Taylor family began reviewing CCTV footage themselves. What they found was damning evidence. Video surveillance clearly showed Jack walking with an unknown man towards Stephen Port's flat in the early hours of September 13. Yet, when they presented this evidence to police, their concerns were brushed aside. Officers maintained that Taylor's death was a tragic but self-inflicted overdose. Stephen Port had been in contact with all 4 victims before their deaths. His DNA was found on some of their bodies, and his address had come up multiple times in connection with these cases. Yet, each time, police failed to investigate further. They ignored multiple red flags, including the fact that all 4 men had died in similar circumstances, the fake suicide note planted on Daniel Whitworth, the CCTV footage showing Jack Taylor's last movements. If authorities had investigated properly, Port could have been stopped after his first victim, Anthony Walgate. Instead, he was free to kill 3 more times. Jack Taylor's family refused to back down. They pushed for a more thorough investigation, demanding that police take their evidence seriously. Under mounting pressure, authorities finally reopened the case. In October 2015, detectives examined Stephen Port's online activity. They discovered that he had been communicating with all 4 victims before their deaths. A deeper search of his flat revealed bottles of GHB and other sedatives hidden in his apartment, personal belongings of the victims, his laptop, which contained disturbing searches related to drugging and sexual assault. On October 15, 2015, Stephen Port was arrested for murder. In October 2016, Stephen Port stood trial at the Old Bailey in London, facing 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of administering a substance with intent, and multiple counts of sexual assault. Prosecutors laid out a disturbing pattern of how Port had lured his victims, drugged them with GHB, and ultimately ended their lives. The jury was presented with CCTV footage of Jack Taylor walking towards Port's flat on the night of his murder, forensic evidence, including traces of Port's DNA on the bodies, Port's online messages, where he discussed drugging and overpowering men. After a 6-week trial, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. On November 25, 2016, Stephen Port was sentenced to life in prison with a whole life order, meaning he will never be eligible for parole. He joined the ranks of Britain's most infamous serial killers, including Ian Brady, Myra Hindley, and Harold Shipman. But the case exposed serious failings within the Metropolitan Police, failings that had allowed Port to continue killing for over a year. Story 11. The murder of James Bulger. On February 12, 1993, the usual hum of shoppers filled the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle, Liverpool. Mothers carried bags, children ran ahead, and store clerks greeted customers. Among them was Denise Bulger, a young mother with her 2-year-old son, James. It was a regular day, until, in an instant, everything changed. James, a lively little boy with big blue eyes, was holding his mother's hand one moment and gone the next. A brief distraction at a butcher's shop counter had given fate enough time to intervene. By the time Denise turned around, her son had vanished into the crowd. Shoppers carried on with their business, unaware that a nightmare had just begun. Elsewhere in the shopping center, two boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, both just 10 years old, wandered through the aisles without an adult in sight. They weren't there to shop. Instead, they were playing a much darker game, watching children, testing boundaries, and seeing what they could get away with. Security cameras captured their movements. The boys were observed stealing random items, some sweets, a can of blue paint, even batteries. They approached multiple young children, seemingly attempting to lure them away. In every case before James, a parent intervened in time. But then, they saw James. What followed was a moment that would shock the world. With childlike ease, Venables and Thompson approached James near a store entrance. No one thought much of it. Just three boys walking together. James, small for his age, must have looked like their younger brother. Witnesses later reported seeing James happily skipping alongside them. They led him out of the shopping center, unnoticed. As Denise frantically searched for her son, the two 10-year-olds led James toward the nearby Leeds and Liverpool Canal. What seemed like harmless wandering was actually deliberate. An attempt to take James somewhere no one could stop them. Along the way, multiple witnesses saw the trio. Some grew suspicious. A few people noticed James crying. One elderly woman even asked if their final destination was an abandoned railway track near Walton, miles away from where they had taken him. It was there that James Bulger would spend his final moments. At the railway tracks, far from prying eyes, the boys began to attack James. They threw bricks and stones at him, kicked him, and dropped an iron bar on his small body. They struck him repeatedly, inflicting horrific injuries. The paint stolen earlier was smeared across his face, as if turning him into a plaything. At some point, James lost consciousness. The boys, seemingly aware they had gone too far, attempted to make his death look like an accident. They placed his small body across the railway tracks, believing a train passing through would erase evidence of their crime. Then, they fled the scene. Hours later, a train did pass over the tracks, but the damage done to James had already been catastrophic. The following day, on February 14th, 1993, James Bulger's body was discovered. The city of Liverpool, and soon the world, was in shock. What seemed like a tragic case of a missing child had turned into one of the most heinous and disturbing murders in modern history. The brutal nature of the crime sent shockwaves through the community. Police initially assumed an adult was responsible. The idea that two 10-year-old boys could have committed such an atrocity seemed unthinkable. However, CCTV footage from the shopping center told a different story. Investigators reviewed the grainy images of James being led away by two small figures. Within days, the public appeal led to hundreds of tips, and soon, a shocking realization emerged. These weren't teenagers or grown men. They were children. Their young ages didn't lessen the horror of what they had done. Instead, it raised deeper, more unsettling questions. As police examined the CCTV footage from the New Strand shopping center, they made a disturbing realization. The figures leading James Bulger away weren't adults. They were children themselves. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigators, who initially struggled to believe that two boys, aged just 10 years old, could be responsible for such an act of cruelty. Within days, thanks to the public appeal and the distinctive clothing seen in the footage, police received a tip-off. A woman recognized one of the boys as John Venables, who had been absent from school on the day of the murder. Shortly after, another tip identified Robert Thompson. On February 18, 1993, just 4 days after James Bulger's body was discovered, both boys were arrested at their homes. What followed was one of the most disturbing interrogations in British criminal history. During their separate police interviews, both boys initially denied any involvement in James' disappearance. However, as investigators presented the evidence, including the CCTV footage, eyewitness accounts, and forensic evidence, their stories began to crumble. John Venables, the more emotionally fragile of the two, broke down first, through tears and panic. He admitted they had taken James but insisted it was Robert's idea. He claimed that Robert had led the violence and that he had just gone along with it. Robert Thompson, on the other hand, remained cold and calculated. He was described as manipulative, showing little emotion throughout the questioning. He initially tried to blame John, but eventually admitted to being present at the crime scene. However, he minimized his own role. Forensic evidence contradicted their attempts to shift blame. Blood and paint found on their clothing matched James Bulger's, and their shoes matched footprints left at the crime scene. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no doubt these two 10-year-old boys had committed an unspeakable act. On November 1st, 1993, the trial of Robert Thompson and John Venables began at Preston Crown Court. Due to the severity of the crime, they were tried as adults, an extraordinary decision given their young ages. The British public was horrified by the details that emerged in court. As witnesses described the boys' actions, the extent of James' suffering became clearer. Pathologists revealed that James had sustained over 42 injuries, making it impossible to determine the exact cause of death. The jury saw the CCTV footage of James being led away. They heard the boys' confessions, forensic evidence, and the cold, remorseless demeanor Robert Thompson displayed in court. The public, the press, and even the legal system struggled to comprehend how two 10-year-old children could commit such an act. The case sparked an intense moral debate about the nature of child offenders. Were Thompson and Venables simply misguided children? Or were they truly evil? On November 24th, 1993, the jury reached its verdict. Both Robert Thompson and John Venables were found guilty of murder, making them the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. Judge Justice Moreland sentenced them to indefinite detention, with a minimum of 8 years, meaning they could be released by age 18 if deemed fit for society. The sentence caused public outrage. Many believed it was far too lenient for such a brutal crime. As the trial ended, the haunting image of James Bulger's final moments lingered in the public's mind. Story 12. The Oklahoma City Bombing. On the morning of April 19, 1995, the city of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, started like any other day. Workers arrived at their offices, children were dropped off at daycare, and government employees settled into their routines inside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, a 9-story structure that housed multiple federal agencies, including the Social Security Administration, the Secret Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF. At 8:57 a.m., an unassuming yellow Ryder rental truck pulled up outside the building. The driver, a man dressed in a baseball cap, sunglasses, and a jacket, calmly exited the vehicle and walked away. 3 minutes later, at 9:00 a.m., the Murrah building was filled with over 500 employees, along with visitors and children in the daycare center on the second floor. No one had any idea of the horror about to unfold. At 9:02 a.m., a massive explosion ripped through the heart of Oklahoma City. The Ryder truck, packed with 4,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, diesel fuel, and other explosives, had been placed directly outside the building's north entrance. The detonation was so powerful that it destroyed 1/3 of the structure instantly. The force of the blast registered as the equivalent of a magnitude 3 earthquake, and could be felt up to 30 miles away. The Murrah building collapsed inward, leaving a gaping hole in its facade. Steel beams twisted like melted plastic, and concrete slabs crumbled into dust. Cars on the surrounding streets were flipped over, and windows shattered across a 16-block radius. People several miles away felt the shockwave, mistaking it for an earthquake or a gas explosion. But as the dust began to settle, the sheer scale of the catastrophe became clear. The scene was one of utter devastation. In the first minutes after the explosion, survivors staggered from the wreckage, bloodied, covered in dust, and disoriented. Some were missing limbs, while others desperately searched for coworkers, friends, and loved ones. The most tragic part of the disaster was the fate of the children in the daycare center. The second floor, where the daycare was located, had collapsed completely. First responders rushed to sift through the rubble, their hands torn and bloodied as they searched for survivors. Many children did not make it. Emergency services arrived within minutes, and firefighters, paramedics, and police officers worked tirelessly to pull people from the wreckage. Civilians joined in, digging through debris with their bare hands. Over 168 people lost their lives, including 19 children. More than 680 others were injured. It was the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history at the time. News of the bombing spread rapidly across the country. Live footage of the destroyed building and rescue efforts dominated television screens. President Bill Clinton, visibly shaken, addressed the nation, calling the attack an act of pure evil. At first, many speculated that foreign terrorists were responsible, given the recent 1993 World Trade Center bombing. But within hours, authorities began piecing together the truth. This was not an attack from overseas, but one carried out by an American citizen. As rescue workers sifted through the rubble of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, first responders worked around the clock to search for survivors. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies scrambled to determine who is responsible for the worst act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history at the time. The FBI and ATF immediately began collecting evidence, searching for clues amid the twisted steel and concrete debris. Investigators retrieved pieces of the yellow Ryder rental truck, including a vehicle identification number, VIN, from an axle that had been blasted several blocks away. This discovery would prove crucial in tracking down the perpetrator. Using the VIN, authorities traced the truck to Elliott's Body Shop, a rental business in Junction City, Kansas. Employees there recalled renting the vehicle to a man who had used the alias Robert Kling. The composite sketch created from their descriptions was soon broadcast across the nation. But before the FBI could even release the sketch, an unexpected breakthrough came from an unlikely source: a local highway patrol officer. Just 90 minutes after the bombing, a state trooper named Charlie Hanger pulled over a yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis near Perry, Oklahoma, about 80 miles north of Oklahoma City. The driver was a calm, clean-cut man with an air of confidence. He had been stopped for driving without a license plate, but when Hanger asked for identification, he noticed something else. The driver was carrying a loaded Glock 21 handgun, along with a knife and extra ammunition. Hanger arrested the man for illegal firearm possession, completely unaware that he had just taken the most wanted man in America into custody. The suspect was booked at the Noble County Jail under the name Timothy McVeigh. Over the next 48 hours, as FBI agents traced the Ryder truck and identified McVeigh as the renter, authorities realized he was already behind bars. On April 21, 1995, just 2 days after the bombing, McVeigh was formally arrested for one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in U.S. history. As investigators dug into McVeigh's past, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Timothy McVeigh, a former U.S. Army soldier, had once dreamed of a military career. However, after serving in the Gulf War, he became increasingly disillusioned with the U.S. government. His anger intensified in the early 1990s, following two major incidents that deeply affected anti-government extremists. Ruby Ridge, 1992. A deadly standoff between federal agents and survivalist Randy Weaver in Idaho, resulting in the deaths of Weaver's wife and son. The Waco Siege, 1993. A 51-day standoff between the FBI and the Branch Davidians, a religious sect led by David Koresh. The siege ended in a fiery inferno that killed 76 people, including women and children. McVeigh, along with his friend Terry Nichols, viewed these incidents as government overreach and tyranny. He wanted revenge, and the Murrah Building, home to the ATF and FBI offices, became his target. His plan was chillingly methodical. He and Nichols gathered supplies, including fertilizer and fuel oil, to construct a massive bomb. On April 17, 1995, McVeigh and Nichols loaded the Ryder truck with explosives in Kansas. McVeigh then drove the truck to Oklahoma City, arriving early on April 19. At 8:57 a.m., he parked the vehicle outside the Murrah Building. By 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated, killing 168 people and injuring over 680 others. McVeigh's meticulous planning, combined with his ability to blend in as an ordinary citizen, made him one of the most infamous domestic terrorists in American history. McVeigh didn't act alone. His former Army buddy, Terry Nichols, played a crucial role in helping him build the bomb. While McVeigh handled execution, Nichols assisted with gathering materials, mixing the chemicals, and providing financial support. When authorities raided Nichols' home in Harrington, Kansas, they uncovered bomb-making materials, anti-government literature, and maps of the Immerse building. Nichols was arrested and charged as a co-conspirator in the attack. As the country reeled from the tragedy, the focus now turned to bringing the perpetrators to justice. With Timothy McVeigh in custody, the U.S. Department of Justice moved swiftly to bring him to trial. The case was one of the most significant terrorism prosecutions in American history, and the government sought the death penalty. Because of the extensive media coverage and the widespread devastation caused by the attack, McVeigh's trial was moved from Oklahoma to Denver, Colorado, to ensure a fair jury selection process. Federal prosecutors, led by Joseph Hartzler, presented overwhelming evidence linking McVeigh to the bombing. The VIN number from the Ryder truck connected him to the rental location. Surveillance footage from the Dreamland Motel in Junction City showed McVeigh checking in the night before the attack. Witnesses from Elliott's body shop identified him as the person who rented the truck under the alias Robert Crane. Bomb-making materials and anti-government writings were found in his possession. His fingerprints were discovered on a receipt for ammonium nitrate fertilizer, a key ingredient in the bomb. Despite the mountain of evidence, McVeigh showed no remorse throughout the trial. His defense team, led by Stephen Jones, attempted to argue that McVeigh was a scapegoat and that other unidentified individuals may have been involved. However, the jury was unconvinced. On June 2, 1997, after less than 24 hours of deliberation, the jury found McVeigh guilty on all 11 federal counts, including conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, destruction of a federal building, resulting in death 3 days later. McVeigh was sentenced to death. While McVeigh was the mastermind behind the bombing, his accomplice, Terry Nichols, also faced federal charges. Unlike McVeigh, Nichols was not present in Oklahoma City at the time of the attack, but he played a key role in procuring materials and aiding in the bomb's construction. His trial, held separately in 1998, resulted in a conviction on conspiracy and involuntary manslaughter charges. However, because Nichols had not personally detonated the bomb, the jury declined to impose the death penalty. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Later, in a 2004 state trial, Nichols was convicted of 161 additional counts of murder and received 161 life sentences, one for each victim. Unlike many death row inmates who spend decades appealing their sentences, McVeigh waived most of his appeals and requested an expedited execution. He later admitted that he saw himself as a soldier in a war against the U.S. government, fully expecting to die for his actions. On June 11, 2001, McVeigh was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. His execution was the first carried out by the U.S. federal government since 1963.